The year is 1494. For 3 years, the Spanish and Portuguese have been racing each other across the Atlantic, desperately trying to outdo one another in the conquest of the New World. But now they've finally decided that perhaps fighting over every new island they come across isn't the best use of their time. So they meet up with the Pope in between conquests to discuss how they can divide the world between them fairly. Well, as fairly as you can divide something up when it comes to European colonialism. And by fairly, I mean not going to war over it. The result of this meeting was the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided pretty much the entire planet between Spain and Portugal. And it's one of the weirdest things we've ever done. The Treaty of Tordesillas was signed on June 7, 1494, by the representatives of the kings of Spain and Portugal in the Spanish city of Tordesillas, just north of Madrid. The treaty was a bull, so to speak, issued by Pope Alexander VI. Now, bulls weren't actually rare for popes. It was kind of like a papal decree. They were basically just used to get around the fact that the Pope didn't want to have to put pen to paper, or, he didn't want to make a mess with his quill. Bulls were also typically used for very serious topics, such as excommunicating people, or, dividing the entire world between two of your favorite kingdoms. And there were 4 main points to this particular bull. First off, the bull declared all of the lands discovered by the Portuguese along the coast of Africa were theirs to keep. And this included any islands they came across, as well as any territories on the mainland that they could conquer and Christianize. Then came the line of demarcation. Basically, any new land discovered west of this line would belong to Spain, and any new land discovered east of it would belong to Portugal. The third point of the bull reaffirmed the Portuguese claim to the island of Madeira, and all the islands of the Azores, which are located smack dab in the middle of the Atlantic between mainland Portugal and the Americas. And finally, the bull gave both countries permission to explore and conquer the entirety of Asia, as long as they didn't get in each other's way. So here's where we start to run into an issue. The line of demarcation set up by the bull started from the tip of mainland Brazil at the South Pole and ran up through the middle of the Atlantic until it reached the island of Cabo Verde, at which point it headed north and then east, splitting off the Azores and Madeira before continuing on to intersect with the coast of Africa near what is today the city of Dakar in Senegal. The problem is that no one was quite sure exactly where the intersection of these two imaginary lines, the one running up from the south and the one running across from the east, actually was, because no one knew exactly how the earth looked. For example, everyone thought India and China were basically the same place, which they're not. And everyone thought Africa looked something like this, which it doesn't. There were also some problems with the Azores and Madeira. While the bull clearly stated that Portugal got those islands, it also said that Spain had the right to explore and conquer any islands that were within 2 miles of any part of the mainland that they conquered. And while Spain and Portugal both thought they owned the western half of the North American continent, neither country had actually made it that far west yet, nor did they have any idea what North America actually looked like. But despite all of these problems, both countries were pretty happy with the agreement and proceeded to ignore it immediately. The Portuguese began by heading south, reinforcing their claim to Brazil by founding the city of Salvador in 1549. Then they went east and started searching for the fabled city of El Dorado, which they never found, but did discover the island of Borneo, which they claimed for Portugal. Meanwhile, the Spanish headed west and discovered the Philippines, which they attached to their existing Mexican colonial holdings. They also began to push north from their settlements in Florida and Texas, eventually reaching the United States. Oh yeah. Also, they invaded and briefly occupied the island of Madeira, which Portugal was, understandably, very mad about. But despite the treaty being completely ignored, no one really cared because everyone was busy getting rich. As the explorers returned home with chests overflowing with gold, silver, jewels, and other riches, the monarchs of Spain and Portugal began to squabble over who actually owned what. But they never really got into any serious conflict over it, thanks in part to the fact that they were related, and also that they were both too busy beating the crap out of everyone else. Then in 1498, Vasco da Gama found a route to India, which made everyone realize just how far off everyone's estimates of where things actually were. When word reached Europe of the vastness of the Americas, the two countries decided to reevaluate the treaty. In 1500, the Portuguese sent an ambassador to Rome to complain that the previous treaty had been a little unfair. But the Pope wasn't having it, mostly because he was dead. By this point, the Catholic Church had gotten fed up with European colonialism and didn't want anything to do with it anymore. So in 1503, Pope Julius II convened a new meeting in the city of Saragossa to renegotiate terms. But this meeting ended without an agreement, largely due to the fact that Spain and Portugal couldn't agree on where the frickin' line was. But luckily for everyone involved, they didn't need a pope to tell them how to be little kids fighting over toys, because they came to the conclusion that instead of arguing over the old treaty, they should just make a new one. On March 11, 1529, the Treaty of Madrid was signed, which established that the line of demarcation now ran from the North Pole down through the middle of the Atlantic and then along the coast of South America until it reached the Pacific Ocean, at which point it headed east until it intersected with the coast of Asia near the island of Guam, which is still a U.S. territory to this day. This meant that the Spanish colonies of Mexico, the Philippines, and Florida remained untouched, while the Portuguese gained control of what is today Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, East Timor, and Macau. They also acquired rights to the Spice Islands, which, back in the 1500s, was basically the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. While the Treaty of Madrid settled most disputes, it left a few islands in limbo, namely the Moluccas, which were given to Portugal despite the fact that Spain had already colonized them. This led to a third and final treaty in 1541, which divided the Moluccas between the two countries. And thus the world was divided. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, didn't I miss something? Where the heck is France? Or England? Well, turns out those guys weren't invited. See, this is where things get weird. You see, the Europeans hadn't quite gotten to the age of total dickishness just yet, and they actually tried to play nice and share the world among themselves. Portugal and Spain had agreed to divide the world between themselves because they didn't want to fight each other. And then the French and English showed up later and were like, hey, what's the party? And the answer was no. Sorry, you're late. We already divided the world. In the case of France, they were actually pretty chill about it and didn't really complain until much later when they realized they were being left out of the loop. Meanwhile, the English took it way less in stride. And when they realized they hadn't been invited to the cool kids' table, they spent the next several hundred years bitching about it non-stop. Now, if you'd like to hear more about the long and storied history of the English vendetta against the Portuguese, be sure to check out my video on the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, which covers everything from Shakespeare to World War II. But in the meantime, if you want to learn more about how the world got divided, be sure to check out my video on how the British split up the world after the 7 Years' War.